Charles Ives, at the age of 4 years old, went to a camp meeting in Danbury, Connecticut, actually just outside Danbury. It was 1878. It was the last official camp meeting that took place, and I want to read you what he said later. He said, "I remember when I was a small boy," but I have to get my other glasses because these don't work. Here we go. Reading glasses. These are reading glasses. It doesn't read very well. No. There, here we go. "I remember when I was a small boy at the outdoor camp meeting services in Reading, that's close to Danbury. All the farmers, their families and field hands from miles around would come afoot in their farm wagons. I remember how both on foot and in the farm wagon, I remember how the great waves of sound used to come through the trees when things like Belula Land, Nearer My God to Thee, The Shining Shore, In the Sweet Bye-Bye, and the like were sung by thousands of let-out souls." He called them let-out souls. And his father, who led the singing, sometimes with his cornet or his voice, sometimes with both voice and arms, and sometimes in quieter hymns with a French horn or violin, would always encourage the people to sing their own way. Most of them knew the words and music by heart and sang it that way. If they threw the poet or the composer around a bit, so much the better for the poetry and the music. There was a power and exaltation in these great conclaves of sound from humanity. That's Charles Ives talking about his experience as a small child going to the camp meeting. People came from far and wide, walking on vehicles of various kinds, farmers, laborers, old people. Now, life was hard in those days, and there was constant adversity in their lives. It was hard to get there. And remember, there was no safety net in those days, nothing to support them. If they had a bad year, it was a catastrophe. And so they sung hymns. They sung hymns because what made this existence bearable was faith in a loving God who promised salvation. That was an essential element. Now, the interesting thing is that everybody knew the tunes. They all knew the tunes and the words. And the hymns held the society together. Nowadays, people know the pop songs. And they know not, the young people all mouth the words. In rehearsal the other day, the first flute was mouthing the words while we were going, because she knew all the songs from her childhood. And so she knew all those hymns. And so it inspired Charles Ives at this point in his life, and we're talking about 1901, 1902. And I want to give you a sense of how this might have worked. I want to tell you that at the end of the third movement of this piece, it's in 3 movements, the end of the third movement, there is a beautifully, fully realized version of a well-known hymn. And the hymn is "Just As I Am Without One Plea." And it goes like this. Then again the phrase that's the hymn. And it's played at this point in the piece, and I'm going to read you the words, what is said here. "Just as I am," you see I need the other glasses, I'm so sorry, I thought these would work, oh maybe they do, no. "Just as I am without one plea, but that thy blood was shed for me, and that thou biddest me come to thee, O Lamb of God, I come, I come." That's what the words are. And when it appears in this piece, it is on a solo cello with all the rest of the cellos an octave below. There's a pizzicato in the basses, very beautifully pizzicato, with a viola accompaniment. And what happens is, in the second phrase, it comes to the second phrase, and then it does something very, very strange. And it stops. And everybody, of course, knew that it should say, I come, but it stops. And what it does is very amazing. The violin does this. Isn't that interesting? Because everybody recognized it immediately, right? Isn't that amazing? The moment I did, actually he leaves out the last three notes because he doesn't need them. So because the moment you hear, you know it's Silent Night. And actually you probably even can hear, oh, holy infant, so tender and mild in your ear, isn't it? That's the way it was for them. And because it was that way, he could do something extraordinary. He could play fragments of the piece, and people would recognize those fragments. And so what he does is a miraculous thing. He starts with the fragments, not with the tune, not with the hymn tune. And he develops it and develops it and develops it. And then eventually comes the full-blown theme. And when it's broken up, and they put the little parenthesis with the Silent Night, when it's all over, the cello says, the solo cello says, I come, I come. And there's a beautiful B-flat major chord. And in the distance, up there in the balcony, you'll hear church bells in a completely different key. And it'll sound gorgeous. It'll sound absolutely uncanny and beautiful and unforgettable. So what he does, he starts with fragments, and if you know the hymn tunes, you'll recognize them as they piece together, and then they move. Now, in this third one, the number 3, the third movement is called Communion. Now, this is the hardest of all the movements to listen to. And so I want to say a word about it. Communion is the most sacred, mystical, inward moment in the Christian faith. This is where the blood of Christ was drunk, the wine, and the wafer is the body. It's a very holy moment, and the music is in a trance. And we play it as if we're in trance because we've been told to do that. There's a very great Ives person in our town called John Heiss, who we all adore, who is deeply steeped in Ives. In fact, one of my members said, Mr. Ives, what do we do here? They thought he was actually Ives himself. He almost is. Anyway, he's coming here tonight. And he told us to play it with more mystery, more sweetness, more far away, never routine. More beautiful, more beautiful. And so we've been playing it very beautifully. But I have a warning for you. It's very dissonant. But the dissonance is not the way dissonance is in other composers, where, for instance, at the opening of the last movement of the Beethoven Ninth, to suggest unrest, violence, anger, whatever it is, to contrast with. In this music, the dissonance is as expressive as the consonance. So this is a new thing for Ives. Ives was the first composer to create dissonance, which is itself as expressive as consonant music. And so when the church bells come in the distances, you will hear them. They're in a completely different key from the music that's been played by the orchestra, but it's beautiful because of that difference. Jan Swafford, who also is coming tonight, has written the most beautiful, I recommend it highly, the best biography of Ives, which he wrote. And he wrote something very beautiful about this. He said, Ives' music is full of distant echoes, memories of Danbury bells, and the vibrant sonority of dissonance is part of those effects. So in other words, the dissonance is part of it, and later on with this piece, with this very symphony, he added some extra lines, shadow lines, which are even more dissonant. And sometimes it's played that way. We are not going to play it because they were added in 1911, long after the piece was written, and so we feel it's more like an anachronism. But sometimes, if you hear this piece, you'll hear with a single violin in the distance playing these shadow lines, and it is the most amazing effect. But we're doing it as he originally wrote it. And there's a moment in the climax of the last movement which it rises up to a tremendous, overwhelming climax. And I'm glad that we have a full symphony orchestra. This piece is often played by a chamber orchestra. But in this hall, with the symphony orchestra playing it full, it seems to be exulting in the power of God. And then it descends to the final hymn. And I must tell you one more thing. There's not only the hymn, Just As I Am, there's another hymn in this movement, which is called There Is a Fountain Filled with Blood. It appears halfway through the movement. You hear the same pizzicato in the basses and the same accompaniment of the viola, but a completely different hymn in the violins. And at the end, they both appear together on the cello and the violin, not because they fit, but because they don't. And it is absolutely magical. It's so exciting. And at the end, after the cello says, I come, the faithful are at peace in community with God. And that's the end of the whole piece. And there's an atmosphere in this room, I think, that will be memorable and actually unique. See, they started out at the beginning of the piece as a bedraggled crew, cacophonous old folks struggling along, coming to the camping site. And they end up at peace and serenity in commune with the divine, which is for the transcendentalists, a metaphor for the arrival in the promised land. So that is the feeling that will be in the room. And it's one of the most beautiful moments in all of music. I do not know anything more beautiful. And when we come to the adagietto of the slow movement of the Fifth Symphony of Mahler, you might remember that feeling in the room at the end of the Ives Symphony. And compare your feeling with what you're feeling at the end of the adagietto. It's a completely different world. Now, the first movement is called Old Folks Gathering. And this is, they're all coming from far and wide, walking and stumbling along. And he uses the same technique. Now, what he does, at the end, you hear the main theme, which is called Oh for a Thousand Tongues, and that's a very suitable theme because they want as many people as possible to be singing, and that's a theme, a beautiful theme. And at the same time, there's another hymn called What a Friend We Have in Jesus, All Our Sins and Griefs to Bear. At the end of the movement, the strings play Oh for a Thousand Tongues, very, very quietly. It's extremely beautiful, like this. And that phrase particularly, if I play it one more time, you'll have it imprinted in your mind. And now when you hear the Ives Third Symphony, you'll hear that phrase and you'll say, oh, that's that beautiful hymn, which I love so much. And the strings play that one, and then the flute plays another hymn, which is called What a Friend We Have in Jesus, and here it is. And he's the flute is in 4, and the strings are in 3. but it sort of works together somehow. It's kind of nice. And the two hymns are woven together in the mind of the listener because they knew them both and they could hear them both. It's an extraordinary idea. So that's at the end of the first movement. Now go back to the beginning of the movement. What he does, you just hear little scraps and fragments of those two themes, and you'll recognize that one now. When it comes, you'll recognize it, and others too. And it moves towards the exposition. In other words, it starts with the development and then goes to the exposition. So it takes the European symphonic structure and turns it upside down and puts it on its head, and it's a perfect symbol for the worn down by life old folks, gathering together, and they move towards the open space of the campsite, singing snippets, getting more and more of the fragments, and then when they're all together at the campsite, they sing together, and you hear the whole thing. So just as the worshippers come from all around the neighborhood, fragments of the hymn tunes appear throughout the orchestra. So many different instruments, a variety of people, each with a different voice, and each struggling to be heard. That's what the first movement is about, just as they struggle in their life to be heard. And they come together finally to sing of the glory of God. And it's a really beautiful, beautiful moment. And that leaves just the second movement to tell you about. The second movement doesn't have that form of beginning with fragments and moving to the realization of the tune, which you have in the first movement and in the third movement. So if you're confused at the beginning of the first movement and the beginning of the third movement, don't mind, because that's intentional confusion. And you'll get a wonderful sense of peace when you finally get to the theme beautifully played. Actually, two themes simultaneously. The second movement is Children's Day, and this is a whole different technique. The music jumps about like children, so it's very childlike. It starts with the patter of children's feet, and then it's cheerful and boisterous, and the kids running around and marching about and skipping. The skipping yum, ba-bum, 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 is everywhere, and fragments of hymns tossed about like balls from one to another. There's a hymn called "There is a Fountain Filled with Blood." That's one of the ones. The children, of course, drank grape juice, but they couldn't wait to grow up and drink wine. And then there's a moment where there is a happy land is another. And then at one moment he plays one with a fragment of a Negro spiritual. Here come the glory days. You'll hear that one. That's thrown in there. So it's the spirit of Children's Day, and at the end they all are tired and fall asleep at the end of the second movement, and then beautifully the beginning of the third movement, out of nowhere, the communion starts. And of course you recognize that because that's the beginning of that hymn. But he doesn't do more than da-da-dee, and then the viola goes dee-da-dee, and the violin goes da-da-dee, and he's playing with that fragment, and it's quite exquisite music. So now the question is, does it matter that you don't know the hymns? And I say no, it doesn't matter at all. Though Lisa, the flute player, and others, my brother-in-law, Neil Rudenstein, who's here, was born in Danbury, said, "Oh, we sang all those hymns at school." Of course, everybody sang those things. But it doesn't matter. I don't let being a Jewish atheist stand in the way in the slightest. I enjoy it all. My father had a wonderful comment when he said, either the Christian story is true, in which case it's the greatest event in the history of the world, or else it's just the greatest tragic poem. And that's the attitude I take. The melodies of old American hymns are absolutely gorgeous. It's part of American heritage, and we are proud to be playing this piece in this great hall.